A chilling first encounter. The hospital was a bustling hive of activity, with nurses in blue scrubs darting back and forth, the steady hum of conversations, and the occasional beep of medical machines punctuating the air. For Ethan Carter, it all felt surreal. He sat in the waiting room, his small legs swinging off the edge of the too-big chair, his fingers nervously drumming against the armrest. He was only 9 years old, but today was a monumental day. He was about to meet his newborn sister. Excited, champ? His father, Mark, asked, putting a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder. His father's dark eyes were tired but bright with anticipation. "You're going to be an awesome big brother." Ethan nodded hesitantly. "I guess." "You'll love her," Mark said, his voice softening. "Just wait." Ethan offered a thin smile, but couldn't shake the weird feeling in his chest. Ever since his parents had announced the pregnancy, a sense of unease had settled in him like a stone. He couldn't explain it. He'd always wanted a sibling, but the closer they got to this day, the stronger the uneasiness became. The waiting room door swung open, and a nurse stepped in, her cheerful smile lighting up the room. "Mr. Carter, would you like to meet your baby girl?" Mark practically leaped out of his seat, pulling Ethan along. They followed the nurse down a long, sterile hallway, the faint scent of antiseptic growing stronger with each step. Ethan's heart began to pound, though he didn't understand why. The nurse pushed open the door to a private room where Ethan's mother, Laura, lay in bed, her face glowing despite her exhaustion. In her arms, wrapped in a soft pink blanket, was the tiny bundle everyone had been waiting for. "Here she is," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, meet your little sister." Mark moved forward eagerly, his face softening as he gazed at the baby. But Ethan froze at the doorway, an icy chill running down his spine. He stared at the bundle, his breathing quickening. Something felt wrong. "Come on, buddy," Mark urged. "Come say hi." Ethan took a hesitant step forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The baby looked exactly how he thought she would, small, pink, with a tuft of dark hair peeking out from under her tiny cap. But the closer he got, the stronger the strange feeling in his stomach grew. His mouth felt dry as sandpaper. "This is your sister," Laura said, adjusting the blanket to show more of the baby's face. "Her name is Sophia." Ethan stared at her, unable to look away. He opened his mouth, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "That's not my sister." The room fell silent, the warm atmosphere cracking like ice. Laura's smile faltered, her gaze darting to Mark. Mark's brows knitted together in confusion. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "Of course, she's your sister." Ethan shook his head, stepping back as if the tiny bundle in Laura's arms were something dangerous. "She's not. I can feel it." "Ethan." Mark's tone was now stern. "Stop that. You're just nervous. She's your baby sister, and you're going to love her." Laura's expression shifted from joy to concern. "Honey, what's wrong? Talk to us." But Ethan couldn't explain it. He couldn't put into words the deep, gnawing sense of wrongness that radiated from the baby like a dark cloud. His throat tightened as he looked at her, and his stomach churned. I'm sorry," Ethan mumbled, turning and bolting out of the room. He heard his parents calling after him, but he couldn't stop running. He needed air, space, anything to escape the oppressive feeling that now gripped him. The sleepless night. That night, Ethan lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The glow in the dark stars above him usually brought comfort, but tonight they seemed distant and cold. He could still see Sophia's face in his mind, hear the soft cooing sounds she'd made. His parents had reassured him over dinner, brushing off his reaction as adjustment jitters. But Ethan knew it was more than that. When his parents' muffled voices drifted up through the vents, he strained to listen. "He's just overwhelmed," Laura said. "It's a big change." "I know," Mark replied, but his voice was laced with frustration. "But that was Extreme. Saying she's not his sister. Where would he even get that idea? Ethan pulled his blanket up to his chin, trying to push their voices out of his mind. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe he just needed time to adjust, like they said. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to come. When it finally did, it brought no peace. The first dream. Ethan was in a forest. The trees were impossibly tall, their twisted branches reaching for a sky devoid of stars. The ground beneath his feet felt strange, soft and spongy like moss, but alive. The air was heavy, pressing against his lungs with each breath. He turned in circles, his heart racing. Shadows danced among the trees, shifting and swaying as if they were alive. And then he heard it, a baby crying. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, high-pitched and unnatural. It didn't echo. It felt like it was everywhere all at once. "Hello," Ethan called out, his voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The crying grew louder, more insistent. He followed the sound, his feet dragging as if the forest itself were trying to hold him back. His breath came in shallow gasps as the trees closed in around him, their gnarled branches reaching for his shoulders like claws. And then he saw it. A figure stood ahead, its outline darker than the night itself. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. In its arms was a small bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. "Sophia," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure turned slowly, its head tilting at an impossible angle. And though it had no face, Ethan could feel its eyes on him, cold, unblinking, and ancient. "She's not yours," the figure rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "She never was." Ethan screamed, and the world dissolved into darkness. When he woke, his t-shirt was soaked with sweat, and his heart thundered in his chest. He sat up in bed, gasping for air, and glanced at the clock. It was 3:17 a.m. The house was silent, save for the faint creak of the floorboards and the occasional groan of the pipes. Then, from down the hall, he heard it. The cry. It was the same sound from his dream. High-pitched, unnatural, and wrong. It didn't echo, but it filled every corner of the house. Ethan froze, his blood turning to ice. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. But deep in his gut, he knew. This was just the beginning. The whispering shadows. Ethan sat at the breakfast table, his spoon stirring his cereal absent-mindedly. The events of the previous night lingered like a storm cloud over him. His parents were cheerful, trading light conversation about Sophia's first night at home, but Ethan was miles away. His mind replayed the dream, the figure in the forest, and the unnatural cry that had pulled him from sleep. "Ethan," his mother's voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you feeling okay?" He looked up, startled. "Yeah, I guess." Mark exchanged a glance with Laura. "Listen, buddy," he said, setting his coffee mug down. "We know yesterday was a big day for all of us. It's okay if it feels strange having a baby around. But she's your sister, Ethan. She's family." Ethan hesitated, searching for the words to express what he felt. He wanted to tell them about the dream, about the figure and its ominous warning, but he knew they wouldn't understand. Instead, he mumbled, "I know." Satisfied with his response, Laura smiled gently. "Why don't you spend some time with her today? She loves her big brother already. I can tell." Ethan forced a nod, his stomach churning. He wasn't sure he could be near Sophia without that strange, suffocating feeling creeping in again. But he also couldn't explain why. The symbols begin. That afternoon, Ethan stood in the doorway of Sophia's nursery. The room, once cheerful and bright with its pastel pink walls and starry mobile, now felt heavy. The air seemed colder here, despite the sunlight pouring in through the window. Sophia lay in her crib, her tiny hands waving lazily as she cooed softly. She looked peaceful, perfect even. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something else was in the room with her, just out of sight. He hesitated before stepping closer. His eyes scanned the crib, the mobile, the stuffed animals arranged neatly on the shelves. Everything seemed normal. But then he saw it. On the wooden rail of the crib, faint but unmistakable, was a strange symbol. It looked as though it had been burned into the wood, a swirling design of sharp angles and curved lines that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. "Mom," Ethan called out, his voice trembling. "Dad?" Laura appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. "What is it, honey?" Ethan pointed to the crib. "That. Look at that." Laura stepped closer, squinting at the symbol. "What are you talking about?" Ethan's heart sank. "The mark. Right there." She leaned in, running her fingers over the wood. "I don't see anything, Ethan. Maybe it's a shadow." "No," he insisted. "It's right there." Mark joined them, glancing between Ethan and the crib. "What's going on?" "He says there's something on the crib," Laura explained, her tone tinged with worry. Mark crouched down, inspecting the spot Ethan pointed to. He sighed. "There's nothing here, son. Maybe you're just seeing things." Ethan clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up. He wasn't imagining it. The mark was there, clear as day. But no matter how much he tried to explain, his parents dismissed it. "Why don't you go play outside for a bit?" Laura suggested gently. "It's a nice day." Ethan stormed out of the room, his mind racing. He knew what he'd seen, and he knew it meant something. The crying in the night. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His room was dark except for the faint green glow of his plastic stars. Every creak of the house set him on edge. He kept glancing at the clock, willing it to move faster, but time seemed to drag. Just as he was beginning to drift off, he heard it again. The cry. It started softly, almost a whimper, but quickly grew louder. It was Sophia, but the sound was all wrong. Sharp, piercing, and filled with a strange, unnatural rhythm. It sent chills down Ethan's spine. He threw off his blanket and crept to his bedroom door, opening it just enough to peer into the dim hallway. The sound grew clearer, echoing down the corridor like a haunting melody. Ethan tiptoed toward the nursery, his heart hammering in his chest. As he approached, the temperature dropped noticeably. His breath came in visible puffs, and his skin prickled with goosebumps. The crying stopped the moment he stepped into the room. Sophia lay in her crib, staring up at him with wide, unblinking eyes. For a moment, they locked gazes. Ethan froze. Her eyes didn't look like a baby's. They were too focused, too knowing. And in that instant, he felt the wrongness again, stronger than ever. The room grew darker, the shadows on the walls twisting and moving as if alive. Ethan backed away, his legs shaking. He could hear something faint, almost a whisper, coming from the corners of the room. Ethan. His name, spoken so softly he wasn't sure if he imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Ethan, help me." He bolted from the nursery, his heart racing. Back in his room, he shut the door and pressed his back against it, trying to catch his breath. The whispers still echoed in his ears. The warning. The next morning, Ethan couldn't keep quiet any longer. As his parents sat at the breakfast table, he blurted out everything. The crying, the symbol, the whispers. Mark frowned, setting down his coffee. "Ethan, we've been patient, but this has to stop. You're scaring your mother." Laura reached out, her voice soft but firm. "Honey, I know it's a big change, but you need to let us help you. Maybe we should talk to someone, like Dr. Haynes." "You think I'm making this up?" Ethan shot back, his frustration boiling over. "I'm not crazy." "Enough," Mark said, his voice rising. "Go to your room, Ethan. We'll talk about this later." Ethan stormed upstairs, slamming his door. He flopped onto his bed, burying his face in his pillow. No one believed him. No one understood. But someone had to. The library encounter. That afternoon, Ethan biked to the local library, determined to figure out what was happening. He combed through the dusty shelves, pulling out books about folklore, symbols, and the supernatural. Most of it was vague and unhelpful, stories about fairies and spirits that felt more like bedtime tales than real answers. He was about to give up when a voice behind him said, looking for something specific. Ethan turned to see an older man with a kind but serious face. He wore a worn flannel shirt and carried an armful of books. Ethan hesitated. The man set his books down on the table. "Name's Amos," he said. "I've lived in this town a long time, seen things most people wouldn't believe. And you, young man, look like someone who's seen something too." Ethan's heart skipped. "You believe me?" Amos nodded slowly. "Depends on what you've seen. Why don't you tell me?" Ethan spilled everything, from the moment he first saw Sophia to the strange events that followed. Amos listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Ethan finished, Amos leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Sounds like you've got yourself a problem with the old kind. Shadows. Takers." "Takers?" Ethan echoed, his stomach dropping. "They're not from here," Amos said. "They slip through the cracks, take what they want, and leave something behind in its place." Ethan's blood ran cold. "You mean Sophia?" Amos nodded grimly. "If she's not your sister, then you've got to figure out what they took. And fast, before it's too late." The secret's beneath. The library was eerily quiet as Amos finished speaking. The sound of the old man's words lingered in the air, heavy and ominous. Ethan stared at him, his mind racing. "Takers," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Amos nodded, his weathered hands resting on the table. Old stories, told to scare children into staying close to the hearth. Most folk don't believe them anymore." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "But I've seen things, boy. Shadows that don't belong. Children who vanish without a trace, and marks like the one you described, burned into wood or flesh. They always mean the same thing." Ethan swallowed hard. "What do they mean?" "They mean the takers have made their claim," Amos said grimly. "They've left something behind in your sister's place, something that looks and acts like a baby. But it's not. It's a changeling." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. "Then, where's my real sister?" Amos exhaled slowly, his eyes dark and sorrowful. "In their realm, most likely. The takers don't steal without reason. They've got their own rules, their own bargains. But one thing's certain. If you don't act soon, the connection between the changeling and your sister will be complete. When that happens, she'll be lost forever. A desperate plan." Ethan's mind was spinning as he pedaled home, Amos's words echoing in his ears. Lost forever. The idea made his stomach churn. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. By the time he reached his house, dusk had begun to settle, casting long shadows across the lawn. He parked his bike in the garage and slipped inside, careful not to draw his parents' attention. They were in the living room, cooing over Sophia as she lay on her playmat. Ethan paused in the hallway, watching them. Sophia looked so normal, so innocent. Her tiny hands reached for a plush toy, and she giggled, the sound light and sweet. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness. He thought about Amos's words, about the takers and their bargains, and his resolve hardened. He needed answers. The hidden mark. That night, Ethan waited until the house was silent. His parents had gone to bed, their door closed, and the soft hum of the baby monitor filled the hallway. Ethan slipped out of his room, his flashlight in hand, and crept toward the nursery. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and he froze, holding his breath. But Sophia didn't stir. She lay in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Ethan moved closer, his heart pounding. He shone the flashlight over her, his hands trembling. At first, everything looked normal. But then, as he carefully rolled up the sleeve of her onesie, he saw it. On the soft, pale skin of her forearm was a faint, glowing mark, The same swirling pattern he had seen carved into the crib. It shimmered faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This was it. Proof. But as he stared at the mark, the air in the room seemed to shift. A chill crept over him, and the shadows in the corners began to move. He turned sharply, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there. And then Sophia stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, and for a moment, they didn't look like a baby's eyes. They were dark and deep, filled with an awareness that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. Her mouth moved, and though no sound came out, Ethan felt the words echo in his mind. "You're running out of time. A fractured family." The next morning, Ethan confronted his parents. He showed them the mark, his voice trembling as he explained everything Amos had told him. But instead of listening, they stared at him with disbelief. "Ethan," his father said, his tone firm, "this has gone too far. We know you've been having a hard time adjusting, but this isn't real. You're scaring us." "But it's right there," Ethan cried, pointing to Sophia's arm. "How can you not see it?" Laura pulled Sophia closer, her face pale. "There's nothing there, Ethan. Please, just stop." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He turned to his father. "You have to believe me. She's not my sister. The takers took her, and—" "Enough," Mark's voice boomed, cutting him off. "I won't hear another word of this. Go to your room." Ethan stood there, his fists clenched, his heart aching with frustration. "You'll see," he said finally, his voice shaking. "You'll see when it's too late." He stormed upstairs, slamming his door behind him. Tears burned his eyes as he flopped onto his bed. They didn't believe him. No one did, except Amos. The forest beckons. That evening, Ethan packed a small backpack with essentials: a flashlight, a notebook, a bottle of water, and the old compass his grandfather had given him. He slipped out of the house and made his way to Amos's cabin on the edge of the forest. The old man was waiting for him, his face solemn. "You're ready, then?" Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "What do I have to do?" Amos led him inside, where the air was thick with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. He spread an old map across the table, pointing to a spot deep within the forest. "This is where the veil between worlds is thinnest. It's where the takers are most likely keeping your sister." Ethan studied the map, his stomach twisting. "How do I get her back?" Amos's eyes darkened. "It won't be easy. The takers don't give up what they've taken willingly. You'll need something to trade. Something valuable." "What kind of something?" Ethan asked, his voice unsteady. "Something personal," Amos said. "A memory, a part of yourself, something they'll find irresistible. But be warned, once they have it, it's gone forever." Ethan's mind raced. He thought about the fishing trips with his grandfather, the warm summer days spent at the lake. He thought about the stories his grandfather used to tell, the lessons he'd shared. Could he give that up? But then he thought of Sophia, trapped in the taker's realm, her tiny hands reaching out for help. He couldn't abandon her. Not now. Not ever. "I'll do whatever it takes," Ethan said firmly. Amos nodded, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Then let's begin." The shadows stir. As night fell, Amos led Ethan into the forest. The air grew colder with each step, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Shadows danced at the edges of Ethan's vision, and faint whispers carried on the wind. The path was marked with symbols carved into the trees, glowing faintly in the darkness. Amos carried a lantern, its flickering light casting long shadows across the ground. When they reached the clearing marked on the map, Amos stopped. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with energy. "This is it," Amos said. He set the lantern down and began drawing a circle in the dirt with a piece of chalk. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Ethan nodded, his hands trembling. He clutched the compass tightly, the cool metal grounding him. As Amos began chanting in a language Ethan didn't understand, The forest seemed to come alive. The shadows grew darker, deeper, and the whispers turned into a chorus of voices. The mark on Sophia's crib appeared in the air before them, glowing with a sickly green light. And then the takers appeared. Into the takers' realm. The clearing in the forest was alive with an unnatural energy. The symbols Amos had drawn glowed faintly in the dirt, their lines pulsing as if responding to his chant. Ethan stood at the edge of the circle, clutching his grandfather's compass. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy and oppressive. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting and writhing as though alive. "They're close," Amos said, his voice low and steady. "Stay inside the circle, no matter what. It's your only protection." Ethan's heart pounded. He could hear the whispers again, louder this time, coming from all directions. They weren't words exactly, but they carried a sinister tone that made his skin crawl. He gripped the compass tighter, the metal cool against his palm. The chanting stopped, and for a moment, the clearing was deathly silent. Then the air grew colder, and the shadows at the edge of the circle began to move. They twisted and converged, forming a shape, tall, thin, and impossibly dark, as though it absorbed every trace of light. The taker had arrived. The bargain. The creature stood at the edge of the circle, its form shifting and flickering like a flame. Its face was a void, featureless, and terrifying, but its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed a deep, malevolent red. "You called," the taker said, its voice like wind scraping through dead leaves. "What do you want, child?" Ethan swallowed hard, his voice trembling but determined. "I want my sister back, my real sister." The taker tilted its head, the motion unnatural and jerky. "Your sister is no longer yours. She belongs to us now. She doesn't belong to you," Ethan shouted, his fear giving way to anger. "You took her. You replaced her with that thing." The taker's laughter was a low, rumbling sound that made the ground beneath Ethan's feet tremble. "You are bold, little one, but boldness alone will not suffice. If you wish to bargain, you must offer something of equal value." Ethan's grip on the compass tightened. "What do you want?" The taker's eyes burned brighter. "Memories, something precious, a piece of your soul." Ethan hesitated, his thoughts racing. His mind immediately went to the memory of the lake with his grandfather. The last time he felt completely safe and happy. The thought of losing it forever was unbearable. But then he thought of Sophia, alone in the taker's realm, and knew what he had to do. "Take it," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Take my memory, the one of my grandfather." Amos turned sharply, his face pale. "Ethan, no, you don't understand." "It's my choice," Ethan interrupted, his eyes fixed on the taker. "Take it and give me back my sister." The taker stepped closer, the air around it crackling with energy. "So be it." The ritual. The taker reached out a shadowy hand, its long, spindly fingers hovering just above Ethan's forehead. A wave of icy cold washed over him, and he felt as though he couldn't breathe. The compass in his hand vibrated, the needle spinning wildly. "Hold still," the taker hissed. "This will only hurt. A little." Pain shot through Ethan's head, sharp and searing, as the taker began to extract the memory. Images of the lake flashed before his eyes. The warm sunlight, the gentle lapping of the water, his grandfather's kind smile. He tried to hold on to them, but they slipped away, dissolving like smoke. When it was over, Ethan staggered, his knees buckling. Amos caught him before he fell, his expression grim. "Your sister," the taker said, its voice filled with cruel amusement. "She is yours again." The shadows around the circle shifted, parting like curtains to reveal a figure. It was Sophia, her tiny form cradled in a cocoon of light. She was sleeping peacefully, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. "Sophia," Ethan cried, reaching out. "Not so fast," the taker said, its voice turning cold. She may be yours in name, but she will always carry the mark of our claim. You cannot undo what has been done." Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the glowing cocoon. "What does that mean?" "It means," the taker said, its form beginning to dissolve into the shadows, "she will never be entirely free of us. And neither will you." With that, the taker vanished, the shadows retreating into the forest. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted. Amos helped Ethan to his feet, his expression heavy with concern. "Is she really back?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amos nodded slowly. "She's back." But the taker wasn't lying. The mark, it binds her to their realm. And you. Ethan looked down at Sophia, now safely in his arms. Her tiny hand reached out, grasping his finger. She felt warm, real. But as he held her, he noticed a faint glow on her arm, the same swirling mark he'd seen before. The mark's curse. The walk back to the house was somber. Amos stayed silent, his weathered face set in a grim expression. Ethan's mind raced with questions, but his body felt too heavy to speak. He clutched Sophia tightly, her soft breathing the only thing grounding him. When they reached the house, Amos stopped at the edge of the yard. "This is where I leave you," he said, his voice low. "But remember, Ethan, the takers never truly leave. Keep her close, protect her, and be ready for whatever comes." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy. "Thank you." As he stepped inside, the warmth of the house felt foreign. His parents rushed to him, their faces filled with relief and confusion. "Ethan, where have you been?" Laura cried, pulling him into a hug. And Sophia, "What? How?" Mark stared at him, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Ethan, you need to explain right now." But Ethan couldn't find the words. How could he explain what had happened in the forest, what he had given up to bring Sophia back? Instead, he simply said, "She's safe now." His parents didn't press further. They were too relieved to see Sophia unharmed, too overwhelmed by the strange, unspoken energy that lingered in the house. A quiet night. That night, Ethan sat by Sophia's crib, watching her sleep. The faint glow of the mark on her arm was barely visible, but it was enough to remind him of the taker's warning. She would always carry their mark, and so would he. As he sat there, a strange feeling washed over him. He tried to recall the memory of the lake, the warmth of the sun, the sound of his grandfather's voice, but it was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. He closed his eyes, willing himself to remember, but all he found was darkness. Sophia stirred, letting out a soft coo. Ethan opened his eyes, a small smile breaking through his sorrow. "You're safe now," he whispered. "That's all that matters." But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over. The takers had taken a piece of him, and their shadows still lingered. The mark on his sister's arm was a reminder that their presence was never far. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, the whispers continued. The shadows persist. The morning sun poured through the windows of the Carter house, casting golden light over the breakfast table. The kitchen smelled of toast and freshly brewed coffee, but the usual warmth of the home felt strained. Ethan sat quietly, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate, while his parents fussed over Sophia. She cooed softly in her high chair, her small fingers grasping at the spoon Laura waved in front of her. "She's so lively today," Laura said with a smile, though her voice carried an edge of nervousness. "It's like she's a completely different baby." Mark chuckled, ruffling Sophia's tuft of dark hair. "Maybe she's just happy to be home." Ethan said nothing, his eyes fixed on the faint swirl of the mark on Sophia's arm. It was barely noticeable in the daylight, but to him, it glowed like a warning. The events of the previous night weighed on him heavily. The bargain with the taker, the sacrifice of his memory, and the lingering dread that this was far from over. "Ethan," his father's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You've barely touched your food." "I'm not hungry," Ethan mumbled, sliding off his chair. "I'll be in my room." Before either parent could protest, he disappeared up the stairs, the sound of his retreating footsteps leaving an uncomfortable silence in the kitchen. Unseen whispers. In his room, Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at his grandfather's compass. The needle spun aimlessly, refusing to settle on a direction. He traced his finger over the cool brass surface, hoping it might bring some sense of clarity. But instead, a faint chill crept into the room, and the shadows in the corners seemed to darken. "You're never truly free," a voice whispered, soft and haunting. Ethan froze, his breath catching. He turned toward the sound, but his room was empty. The air grew heavier, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. The whisper came again, this time from the opposite corner. "You brought her back, but the mark remains, and we are always watching." Ethan's heart raced. He stood quickly, grabbing the compass and clutching it tightly. "Leave us alone." A low, echoing laugh filled the room, sending shivers down his spine. "We gave you what you wanted, little one, but nothing comes without a price." The shadows in the room writhed and twisted, forming shapes that seemed almost human. Ethan stumbled backward, his back pressing against the door. He squeezed his eyes shut, silently willing the visions to go away. When he opened them again, the shadows had returned to their normal stillness, and the chill in the air had lifted. But the voice lingered in his mind, a constant reminder that the taker's influence had not been banished. A visit from Amos. Ethan biked to Amos's cabin that afternoon, his hands gripping the handlebars so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The forest seemed darker than usual, the towering trees casting long, jagged shadows across the path. Even in the daylight, the place felt alive with a malevolent presence. Amos was outside, chopping wood, when Ethan arrived. The old man paused, wiping sweat from his brow as he watched Ethan approach. His expression darkened when he saw the fear in the boy's eyes. "They're still here, aren't they?" Amos said, his voice heavy. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. "They whispered to me this morning. They said, they're always watching." Amos sighed, setting his axe down and motioning for Ethan to follow him inside. The cabin was dimly lit, its shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and old books with cracked spines. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering light across the room. "They won't let go so easily," Amos said, sitting down at the worn wooden table. "The mark binds them to your sister, and through her, to you. It's their way of keeping a foothold in this world." Ethan clenched his fists. "But I made the deal. I gave them my memory. Isn't that enough?" "Enough for what?" Amos replied, his voice sharp. "The takers are creatures of greed. They never stop wanting. You've opened a door to their world, and now they'll keep pushing, looking for cracks they can exploit." Ethan sat down heavily, his head in his hands. "What can I do?" Amos reached for an old leather-bound book, flipping through its brittle pages until he found what he was looking for. He pushed the book toward Ethan, revealing an illustration of a swirling symbol nearly identical to the one on Sophia's arm. "The mark is a tether," Amos explained. "It ties them to her. If we can break the tether, they'll lose their hold." Ethan's eyes widened. "How do we break it?" Amos's expression darkened. "It's dangerous. The takers won't let you sever the connection without a fight. And the process, it requires a great deal of strength. More than I'd expect from most grown men, let alone a boy." "I'll do it," Ethan said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Amos studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but we'll need to prepare." The preparations. Over the next few days, Ethan spent every spare moment at Amos's cabin, learning the ritual to sever the mark. The process was intricate and grueling, requiring focus and determination. Amos taught him how to draw protective symbols, how to use salt to create barriers, and how to channel his own energy into the ritual. "Your willpower is your greatest weapon," Amos said one evening as they practiced. "The takers will try to break you, to make you doubt yourself. If they succeed, the ritual will fail. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. I won't let them. Amos handed him a small ornate mirror, its surface polished to a gleaming shine. This will reveal their true forms. Keep it close. Ethan took the mirror, feeling its weight in his hands. It seemed to hum faintly, as though it were alive. When the time comes, Amos said, you'll need to face them alone. I can guide you, but the fight is yours. The night of the ritual. The night of the ritual arrived, and the air was heavy with anticipation. Ethan stood in the clearing where he had first confronted the taker, the protective circle glowing faintly around him. The mirror hung from a cord around his neck, and he held a small vial of salt in one hand and the compass in the other. Sophia lay in the center of the circle, sleeping peacefully. The mark on her arm glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the oppressive energy that filled the clearing. Amos stood at the edge of the circle, his expression grave. Remember, Ethan, stay inside the circle, no matter what. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath and began the ritual, reciting the incantation Amos had taught him. The words felt heavy on his tongue, each syllable resonating in the air around him. The forest responded immediately. The shadows grew darker, deeper, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The mark on Sophia's arm flared brightly, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. They're coming, Amos said, his voice low. The taker materialized at the edge of the clearing, its form even more menacing than before. It stepped forward, its red eyes burning with fury. You dare defy us, it hissed, its voice echoing through the trees. Ethan stood his ground, his voice steady as he continued the incantation. The taker lunged toward him, but the circle's protective barrier flared, stopping it in its tracks. It howled in anger, its shadowy form writhing. You cannot break the bond, the taker snarled. She belongs to us. Ethan ignored it, pouring all his focus into the ritual. The mirror around his neck began to glow, reflecting the taker's true form, the withered, grotesque creature, its skeletal frame twisted and broken. The taker recoiled from the reflection, its cries growing louder. Stop, it roared. You do not understand the consequences. Ethan's voice rose, drowning out the taker's screams. The mark on Sophia's arm flared brighter, then began to fade, its glow dimming with each word Ethan spoke. The taker thrashed and howled, but it was powerless to stop the ritual. Finally, with one last word, the mark disappeared entirely, and the taker let out a final bone-chilling scream before vanishing into the shadows. The clearing fell silent. The aftermath. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. Amos rushed to his side, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. You did it, Amos said quietly. The bond is broken. Sophia stirred, her tiny hands reaching out. Ethan scooped her up, tears streaming down his face. She felt warm, real, and whole. The forest around them seemed lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. But deep in his heart, Ethan knew the takers were not truly gone. Their whispers might return someday, their shadows lurking just out of sight. But for now, Sophia was safe, and that was enough. The consequences of courage. The Carter household was unusually quiet the morning after the ritual. The oppressive heaviness that had lingered for weeks was gone, replaced by an almost eerie calm. Ethan sat at the breakfast table, nursing a bowl of cereal he wasn't hungry for. His parents bustled around the kitchen, trading glances filled with both relief and confusion. Sophia sat in her high chair, gurgling happily. The faint mark on her arm had disappeared entirely, leaving no trace of the taker's presence. She looked more like a normal baby than ever, her laughter light and free of the strange undertones that had once chilled Ethan to the bone. You're spending so much time with her these days, Laura said with a soft smile as she placed a mug of coffee in front of Mark. It's like she's your favorite person now. Ethan glanced at his mother and managed a faint smile. She had no idea what he'd endured to bring Sophia back, and he wasn't sure he could ever tell her. Mark sat down beside him, placing a firm but kind hand on his shoulder. "You did good, kid. I don't know what changed, but it's like the whole house feels lighter." Ethan nodded but said nothing. He didn't trust himself to speak. The events of the night before were still fresh in his mind. The ritual, the taker's screams, and the moment the mark on Sophia's arm had vanished. He had saved her, but at what cost? The lingering shadows. Ethan spent the rest of the day trying to settle into normalcy, but it was harder than he had anticipated. Though the taker was gone, and the bond had been broken, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows in the corners of rooms seemed darker, deeper, and sometimes, when he wasn't paying attention, they moved. It wasn't just the shadows. The whispers were faint but persistent, like an itch he couldn't scratch. They were quieter than before, but they were still there. Soft voices that spoke his name, beckoning him. That evening, as he sat in his room, the compass on his desk began to spin. The needle whirled around wildly, and a faint, chill breeze swept through the room. Even though the window was closed, Ethan grabbed the compass, gripping it tightly as he whispered, "Leave me alone." The whispers grew louder, almost mocking. "Did you think it would be that easy, little one?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "You're gone. The bond is broken. But you bear the mark now," the voice hissed. "You and the child are ours, no matter what you believe." He glanced at his reflection in the mirror on his wall. There, faint but unmistakable, was a swirl of glowing lines on his forehead, a mark similar to the one Sophia had carried. He staggered backward, his chest tightening. Amos's warning. The next morning, Ethan returned to Amos's cabin. The old man was waiting for him on the porch, his sharp eyes narrowing as Ethan approached. Without a word, Amos gestured for Ethan to follow him inside. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" Amos said, his voice heavy with resignation. "The mark." Ethan nodded, pulling his hood up to hide the faint glow on his forehead. "I thought breaking the bond would get rid of them. Why is this happening?" Amos sighed, rubbing his temples. "When you severed the bond, you took the mark onto yourself. It was the only way to protect your sister. The takers can't reach her anymore, but you've become their target." Ethan's heart sank. "What does that mean? Are they going to take me?" "They'll try," Amos admitted, "but the mark binds you in a different way. It gives them a connection, yes, but it also gives you a certain resistance. They can't claim you as easily as they could your sister." Ethan frowned. "So, what do I do now? How do I stop them?" "You can't stop them," Amos said bluntly. "Not entirely. But you can fight back. The mark makes you a bridge between their world and ours. That's a dangerous thing, but it also gives you power. You'll need to learn how to use it." A new reality. Over the following weeks, Ethan began to notice more changes. His senses sharpened, allowing him to see, hear, and feel things no one else could. He could sense the presence of the takers even before they appeared, their shadowy forms lurking just out of sight. The compass became an extension of him, its spinning needle calming when he focused on it. He discovered he could use it to detect the thin places where the takers whirled blood into his own. Amos called these veils, fragile points where the boundaries between dimensions were weakest. Ethan also noticed a strange energy within himself. When he concentrated, he could summon a faint glow from the mark on his forehead. It felt warm and powerful, pushing back the shadows when they grew too close. "It's a gift and a curse," Amos told him during one of their training sessions. "The takers fear light, especially light from within. Use it wisely." A new threat. One afternoon, as Ethan played with Sophia in the backyard, he felt a familiar chill creep over him. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the tree line at the edge of their property. The shadows beneath the trees were darker than they should have been, and he could swear he saw movement. He scooped Sophia into his arms and hurried inside, locking the door behind him. His mother called out from the kitchen, "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Ethan lied, his voice tight. "Just wanted to bring Sophia in." That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They spoke of bargains unfulfilled, debts unpaid, and a hunger that could never be satisfied. Ethan gritted his teeth, clutching the compass as he whispered, "You can't have her. You can't have me." The whispers fell silent, but the shadows in the corners of his room seemed to ripple, as though laughing at him. The veil weakens. One evening, Amos visited the Carter household for the first time. His presence seemed to put Laura and Mark at ease, though they didn't understand why. Over dinner, Amos spoke in vague terms, carefully avoiding any mention of the takers or the supernatural. After the meal, he pulled Ethan aside. "The veils are thinning," Amos said in a low voice. "It's not just your home. The takers are growing bolder. If we don't act, more people could be affected." Ethan's stomach turned. "What do we do?" Amos handed him a small leather-bound journal. "This contains everything I know about the takers. Their strengths, their weaknesses, their rules. Study it. You'll need every bit of knowledge you can get." The revelation. Late that night, Ethan sat in his room, poring over the journal by flashlight. The pages were filled with drawings, notes, and stories about the takers. One entry caught his eye, detailing a rare phenomenon known as the reclaiming. According to the journal, the takers sometimes attempted to reclaim what had been taken from them, using the marked individual as a conduit. The process was dangerous and often led to catastrophic consequences for both worlds. Ethan's blood ran cold. He flipped the page and saw an illustration of a child standing at the center of a swirling vortex of shadows, their mark glowing brightly as figures emerged from the darkness. The caption beneath it read, "Only the strong of heart can resist the reclaiming. Most succumb." The whispering storm. As Ethan closed the journal, the wind outside picked up, howling against the windows. The shadows in his room began to move again, writhing like living things. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and this time they carried a clear message. The child was ours. You were never meant to interfere. We will come for you both. The mark on Ethan's forehead burned, and the compass spun wildly in his hand. He closed his eyes, focusing on the faint glow within him. The light pushed back against the darkness, but the voices didn't fade. Instead, they laughed, a low, bone-chilling sound that echoed in his mind. Ethan opened his eyes, his resolve hardening. He had saved Sophia once, and he would do it again if he had to. The takers might be relentless, but so was he. The reclaiming. The night stormed on, wild and furious, as Ethan sat huddled in his room, with Amos's journal in one hand and the compass in the other. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, and the mark on his forehead burned with an intensity that felt almost alive. He could feel the presence of the takers growing closer, their shadowy tendrils probing the edges of his mind and his home. Somewhere down the hall, Sophia's soft coos drifted through the baby monitor, a faint reminder of the stakes at hand. Ethan stood abruptly, his heart pounding. He couldn't wait for the takers to come to him. He had to act. The warning in the journal. Before leaving his room, Ethan scanned the pages of the journal again. One passage stood out, the letters seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. The reclaiming is not simply an attempt to recover what was taken, but a tearing of the veil between worlds. Those marked are both the key and the anchor. The takers will not stop until their hold is complete. Below it, Amos had scrawled a note in his uneven handwriting. Light is their greatest enemy, but not all light. Only that which comes from within, the light of courage, of sacrifice. The marked must use their inner strength to confront the reclaiming. The stronger the heart, the stronger the light. Ethan closed the book with trembling hands. Courage, sacrifice, inner strength. These were just words. How could he possibly fight an ancient, otherworldly force with something as intangible as that? But then he thought of Sophia, her tiny hand reaching for his, her laughter piercing through the darkness that had enveloped their lives. For her, he would find the strength. The thin veil. Ethan crept down the stairs, careful not to wake his parents. The storm outside had grown fiercer, the wind howling like a living thing. He pulled on his jacket, the journal tucked under one arm, and slipped into the night. The forest loomed before him, its edges flickering with an eerie greenish glow. The compass in his hand spun wildly, its needle trembling as though it too could sense the malevolence ahead. He followed its pull, the spinning slowing to a steady point as he approached a familiar clearing. It was the place where the ritual had taken place, but it had changed. The air shimmered with unnatural energy, and the ground beneath his feet felt spongy and alive, pulsing with every step he took. The veil was thinner here, weaker. The takers were already at work. Amos stepped out of the shadows, his face grim. "You felt it too." Ethan nodded, gripping the compass tightly. "They're coming. I don't know how to stop them." Amos placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You've already taken the first step, lad. You didn't run. The reclaiming begins." As they stood in the clearing, the air grew colder, and the shadows around them began to shift and writhe. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, a chorus of voices that seemed to echo from every direction. "Return the child. She belongs to us." Ethan squared his shoulders, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "She's not yours. She was never yours." The shadows coalesced, forming a towering figure with glowing red eyes and long, twisting limbs. It was the taker, but it was no longer alone. More figures emerged from the darkness, their shapes flickering and distorted, as though reality itself rejected their presence. Amos stepped forward, his iron blade glinting in the faint light. "Stay in the circle, Ethan. No matter what happens, don't leave." Ethan hesitated, clutching the compass. "What about you?" Amos gave him a grim smile. "I've been fighting these things my whole life. It's time I finish what I started. A fight for survival." The takers surged forward, their movements unnatural and jerky. Amos swung his blade, the iron cutting through the shadows like light through fog. The creatures hissed and recoiled, but for every one that fell back, two more took its place. Ethan knelt in the center of the circle, the compass and the journal before him. He flipped through the pages, searching desperately for something he'd missed, some way to push the takers back for good. But the words blurred together, the storm of whispers in his mind growing louder. The taker's voice cut through the chaos, low and resonant. "You cannot win. The child is marked, and so are you. You are ours." Ethan's hand shook, but he forced himself to focus. He closed his eyes, remembering Amos's words, the light of courage, of sacrifice. He thought of Sophia, her innocent smile and trusting eyes. He thought of his parents, their love and worry. He thought of the life he wanted for all of them, a life free of the taker's shadow. A warmth began to build in his chest, faint at first, but growing stronger. The mark on his forehead tingled, and the light within him flared. The light within. Ethan opened his eyes, and the mark on his forehead shone brightly, casting a warm, golden light that pierced through the darkness. The takers hissed and recoiled, their forms flickering and fading in the glow. Amos turned, his face filled with awe. "That's it, Ethan. Keep going." The takers surged again, their voices rising in a deafening cacophony. Ethan gritted his teeth, focusing on the light. He pushed against the fear, the doubt, and the whispers that clawed at his mind. The light grew brighter, spreading outward from the circle. The ground trembled, and the air crackled with energy. The takers screamed, their forms unraveling as the light consumed them. The towering figure of the taker stepped forward, its red eyes burning with fury. "You think you can defeat us? You are nothing but a child." Ethan stood, the light radiating from him like a shield. "Maybe I am, but you'll never have her. You'll never have me." With a final burst of light, the taker let out a deafening roar and dissolved into nothingness. The clearing fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting like a heavy weight. A fragile piece. Ethan sank to his knees, exhausted. The light faded, and the mark on his forehead dimmed to a faint glow. Amos helped him to his feet, his face filled with pride. "You did it, lad," Amos said softly. "You drove them back." Ethan shook his head. "Are they gone?" "For good?" Amos' expression grew somber. "For now. But the veil is still weak. They'll always try to find a way back." Ethan looked toward the forest, where the shadows were still and silent. "Then I'll be ready." The morning after. The next morning, Ethan sat in the living room with Sophia in his lap. She giggled, her tiny hands reaching for his face. The storm had passed, and the house was filled with sunlight. Laura and Mark watched from the kitchen, their smiles filled with relief. For the first time in weeks, the tension in their home was gone. Ethan glanced at the faint swirl of light on Sophia's arm, a reminder of the battle they had fought. The whispers might return, and the shadows might grow again, but for now, they had peace, and that was enough. A new dawn. The days following the confrontation in the forest were filled with an almost surreal sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, the Carter household felt like a home again. The lingering heaviness that had once pressed on its walls was gone, replaced by a gentle warmth that seemed to emanate from every corner. Ethan sat cross-legged on the living room floor, building a small tower of blocks for Sophia. She giggled as she knocked it over, her laughter ringing through the room like music. Her tiny hands reached for another block, her face alight with joy. "She's happy," Laura said from the couch, her voice soft. She sipped her tea, her gaze lingering on Sophia. "She's so different now. It's like she's lighter." Mark nodded, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed. "It's like a cloud's been lifted. Whatever happened, I'm just glad she's okay." Ethan glanced at his parents but said nothing. They didn't know the full truth of what had transpired. The deal with the taker, the fight to sever the bond, or the faint glowing mark on his own forehead that he kept hidden beneath his hoodie. Some things, he decided, were better left unsaid. The shadows that linger. Though the takers had been banished, Ethan knew their presence wasn't gone entirely. The mark on his forehead was a constant reminder of the connection he now shared with their realm. At night, when the house was quiet, he could still hear faint whispers, like echoes from a faraway place. One evening, as he lay in bed, the whispers grew louder. They weren't as menacing as before, but they carried a tone of curiosity, almost pleading. "Why fight us? We only take what is ours." Ethan sat up, his hand instinctively going to the compass on his nightstand. The needle was still, pointing north, but he could feel the faint vibration of its energy in his palm. "She's not yours," he whispered into the darkness. "She was never yours." The whispers faded, and the room grew silent again. But Ethan knew they would return. Amos's final gift. The next day, Ethan visited Amos at his cabin. The old man greeted him with a rare smile, his weathered face softening as he ushered Ethan inside. "You look stronger," Amos said, pouring 2 mugs of tea. "That light inside you, it's growing." Ethan nodded, sitting at the worn wooden table. "I can still feel them sometimes. Hear them. They're not gone. They never will be," Amos said, his tone heavy with understanding. "The takers are part of the balance. But so are you now. You've become a guardian, Ethan, whether you like it or not." Ethan looked down at the tea, steam curling upward in delicate spirals. "A guardian?" Amos nodded, reaching for a small leather-bound package on the shelf behind him. He handed it to Ethan, his expression solemn. "This belonged to my mentor. He passed it to me when I was young, just like you. Now it's your turn." Ethan unwrapped the package, revealing a beautifully crafted iron blade. Its hilt was wrapped in worn leather, and intricate symbols were etched along the blade's surface. It felt heavy in his hands, but there was a strange sense of comfort in its weight. "This will help you protect your family," Amos said. "And yourself. The mark on your forehead. It's not just a tether. It's a source of power. Learn to use it. Building a new life, Over the following weeks, Ethan devoted himself to studying the journal Amos had given him, as well as practicing with the blade. He learned about the thin places where the veil between worlds was weakest, the signs of the taker's presence, and the ways to ward them off. He also spent as much time as possible with Sophia. She had become his anchor, her laughter and innocence reminding him of what he was fighting for. The two of them were inseparable, and even Laura and Mark began to comment on the bond between them. "She lights up whenever you're around," Laura said one afternoon as Ethan played with Sophia in the yard. "I don't know what it is, but you've got a connection with her." Ethan smiled, tickling Sophia's chin as she squealed with delight. "I guess I just get her." The return of the shadows. One night, months after the confrontation in the forest, Ethan woke to the sound of Sophia crying. It was a normal baby's cry, but something about it felt off. He sat up, his heart pounding, and grabbed the compass from his nightstand. The needle was spinning wildly. He rushed to the nursery, his breath catching as he pushed the door open. Sophia was sitting up in her crib, her tiny fists rubbing her eyes. The room felt colder than usual, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move. Ethan stepped inside, clutching the compass tightly. "I'm here, Sophia," he said softly. As he approached the crib, a faint greenish glow appeared on the wall. It was the swirling mark of the takers, faint but unmistakable. Ethan's stomach dropped. "You can't have her," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "She's mine." The glow faded, and the room grew still. Sophia looked up at him with wide eyes, her cries softening as he picked her up. Ethan held her close, his mind racing. The takers weren't done with them. They never would be. A guardian's oath. The next morning, Ethan returned to Amos's cabin. The old man was waiting for him, as if he had known Ethan would come. "They tried again," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "I saw the mark in her room." Amos nodded grimly. "They'll keep testing you, looking for weaknesses, but you've proven stronger than they expected. That's why they haven't been able to take her back." Ethan clenched his fists. "How do I stop them for good?" "You can't," Amos said gently, "but you can protect her. The mark on your forehead, it's not just a burden. It's a shield. As long as you carry it, the takers will think twice before coming too close." Ethan looked down at the blade Amos had given him, its surface glinting faintly in the light. He thought of Sophia, her laughter and smiles, and the family he had fought so hard to protect. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly. "I'll keep her safe." Amos placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression proud. "You've already done more than most ever could. But remember, Ethan, you're not alone. The light inside you is stronger than any shadow, and it always will be." A new legacy. Ethan returned home that evening, the iron blade hidden beneath his bed and the compass placed carefully on his nightstand. He sat by Sophia's crib, watching her sleep. The faint glow of the mark on her arm was gone, replaced by the soft rise and fall of her breathing. For the first time, Ethan felt a sense of peace. The takers might return, but he was ready. He had faced them before, and he would face them again if he had to, because Sophia was worth it. As he leaned down to kiss her forehead, she stirred, her tiny hand reaching out to grasp his finger. He smiled, his heart swelling with love and determination. "You're safe," he whispered, "and you always will be." Outside, the night was quiet, the stars shining brightly against the dark sky. The shadows were still, and the whispers were silent. For now. But Ethan knew that the light within him would burn brighter than any darkness that dared to come.